Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today, we are going to be talking about women and the recitation of Kaddish. And joining us today, we have the privilege of having Shalhevet Cahana with us, who teaches Gemara and Halacha at Manhattan Day School and serves as community scholar at Beth Jacob Congregation in Oakland, California. She has taught Torah in over 65 shuls and campuses in North America, France, and Israel. Shalhevet is a Kala teacher with a holistic approach, teaching the core halachos of Nida Mikvos, as well as marital relationships and healthy communication skills. Shalhevet was trained by the Eden Center in Eretz Yisrael. She previously studied in Maimonides School, Migdal Oz, Stern College for Women, and their advanced Gemara program called the Graduate Program for Advanced Talmudic Studies, aka GPATS. She lives with her husband, Dvir Kahana, in Washington Heights. And I believe you know my wife, Marissa, from Queens College when you were doing some education there as well. As you're very modest, you didn't put your full portfolio into the bio. But rest assured, our listeners, she has many more accomplishments than were mentioned today. And the reason we're going to be doing Women in Kaddish, actually, is in addition to, of course, your expertise you're going to share with us, we actually 2 episodes ago, when we had Rabbi Eli Slemnicki on, we were talking about a Teshuvah from Shlomo Wahrman, and we happened to discuss Women in Kaddish more in passing. And I thought I got a lot of feedback, and I thought it was really important for us to actually dedicate a specific episode to unpacking this very important and relevant topic. And in addition to Shalhevet's expertise in teaching, I know you also bring a personal element to this particular topic. So maybe before we jump into the Teshuvos of the Chavos Yair and all the other wonderful sources that you provided me, maybe you could just share with us why you chose this topic personally.
Rabbi, it's such an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. Yes, this topic of women saying Kaddish is personal because I had to say Kaddish. I learned from one of my rabbis, Rabbi Dardik. He asked, why is it that someone asks a shaila? Sometimes they ask because they're curious. Sometimes someone asks a question to a rabbi because they're confused about the halacha. They're not sure what it should be. But the last reason is because of mitzias. There's something in your personal reality. Oh no, Rabbi, I accidentally put the dairy spoon in the meat pot. That's a mitzias kind type of question. But on a more serious note, for me, I lost my father in my mid-late 20s. It was a very challenging experience. And when my siblings and I were thinking about how we wanted to honor our father's memory, looking to Kaddish made a lot of sense for us. Something that's extraordinary about Yiddishkeit, and I'd even say about most world religions, is the goal is to take the metaphysical, spiritual, something that is inside our hearts already, or we want to be inside of our hearts, and we look for a channel, a place for our soul to go to concentrate that energy. And we know with other life cycle events like a birth, we have a Brit Milah. It's now becoming more common to have a Zavat Habad or Simchat Bat. We have B'nai Mitzvah rituals, we have marriage rituals. And when someone's life starts to come to a close, if they are Zocha to be able to say the Vidui before they die and to be able to say Shema, that is incredible. But what happens when a person's passed away? So the person, if they have children, or if they have someone else for whom they can say Kaddish, that can be an extraordinary opportunity for that person's own neshama, and especially for the children surviving, to channel their love and their sadness and their grief. So when I lost my father, it was a very special thing for me and my siblings to explore this halachic question with each other, with our rabbis. And I hope that people who are here listening to this podcast, that this can be an opportunity for you to start thinking about this, whether it's relevant for you personally or for someone in your community.
Thank you. I really appreciate you opening up with that. And I think it's very true. I think from a spiritual standpoint, from a personal standpoint, Kaddish is a very powerful prayer that from my experience in the rabbinate, regardless of one's level of observance, I always find that that's kind of like the great equalizer. Everyone wants to say Kaddish. Everyone values Kaddish. And it's very clear from our tradition as well. Perhaps one of the most off-cited sources, even though it's hard to pin down exactly where it came from, but the Or Zarua is one of them, is the story of Rabbi Akiva, who's contacted from the great beyond, from someone who is in Gehenna suffering, and Rabbi Akiva tracks down his son to say Kaddish. Now,
Yes.
I guess the question is going to be, and I'd love for you to talk about, you mentioned that you had halachic questions going in about saying Kaddish. We have a source about son saying Kaddish. We have the Gemara that says, Bara Mizaka Abba, that a son confers merit upon his father. So I guess the question is son here being used as a gender specific term, or as we call in modern parlance, a gender neutral term, just by dint of how the Hebrew language operates?
Sure. When talking about the origin of where Kaddish comes from, there are two origin stories that we know of. One is from the Tana Devei Eliyahu that tells us a story about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who encounters someone collecting wood, and this person says, "I have already passed away." And then he explains that he was a Baal Avira in his lifetime, and now that he had passed away, this, even though he was still in this world, he was collecting wood to burn himself in Gehenna. And he relates to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that if he has a son who is able to free him from Gehenna through the act of saying Baruch Hu B'tzibor and learning Torah, that would be able to release him. And there's a similar version that's cited in the Or Zarua. It's a longer version involving Rabbi Akiva that's quoting the Kala Rabati. But in the Or Zarua version, it's slightly different, that it's not clear whether the collector gave birth to a boy or a girl, whereas in the Tana Devei Eliyahu says specifically boy. And it was only afterwards that Rabbi Akiva did find out that it was a boy and encouraged him to learn Torah. And Rabbi Akiva taught this son how to recite Baruch Hu and Kaddish. So when looking at these origin stories, it's these origin stories, I don't know how literally we're supposed to take them, right? I think there's many lessons we can derive from like what the story is. I think the most clear lesson is that we believe in Judaism about Hisha'arut HaNefesh, the eternality of the soul. And even though we usually think that the burial process is taking the mace, lowering them into the ground, and pouring dirt over them to do that chesed shalemet, what we're learning from these origin stories of Tana Devei Eliyahu, the Or Zarua, and Kala Rabati is that the burial process extends long after the body's actually in the ground, that because the soul remains and because the person is no longer alive to actually do teshuvah for their averos, they are reliant on their children or others to do that process of freeing them from Gehenna. And so in this way, what we see is that the burial process is physical and spiritual. The physical lowering of the body and the spiritual elevation that can come through saying Kaddish. And that's why I believe saying the words Li'ilui Nishmat is actually quite literal. It's to literally raise the neshama.
Right, 100%. And that's, really the purpose of the recitation of Kaddish. Well, I guess we'll get into this, numerous purposes about honoring. But one of the main ideas is that to some degree, you're conferring some kind of merit upon them. I remember I guess this was an early pastoral lesson for me. I got into some minor trouble one time at a Shiva home. I conducted the minyan, and then at the end of the minyan, I was sitting with the Avelim, and they kind of just did rapid fire around, asking me all sorts of questions. All the things like leather shoes, when can I shave, when can I get a haircut, when can I take a proper shower, and we were just going through all of them one by one, nonchalantly. And then one is like, oh wait, so Kaddish, wait, why for Ashkenazim we just say it for 11 months? So I said, oh, that's because we believe that the soul has a chance and it might be in Gehenna. It's a good insurance policy to say Kaddish. That way that it helps ease their suffering and it brings them out. And one of the Avelim there was like, wait, you're saying that my parent is suffering in Gehenna right now? And I was like, oh, that's I didn't mean it like that. So it's a reminder for me, like, we're going to engage with this, I think, on a more intellectual level to understand the halachos behind it. But I really appreciate you bringing kind of the spirituality and the personal part, which can't be forgotten as well. So what I find really fascinating is I never noticed that reading of the Or Zarur that you brought up. That it was only post facto, you're saying, that Rabbi Akiva discovered it was a son. But you're saying initially, possibly, Rabbi Akiva was looking for any child, a son or a daughter, potentially. Is that the argument that you're making?
Regarding the Or Zarua, I'm my read of Rabbi Akiva is that he didn't know from the woodcutter the gender of the child, if it was a boy or a girl. And it's
Interesting.
interesting that Rabbi Akiva then went to this person's surviving widow and orphan to then discover that it was a boy. And the
Hmm.
question is, if this child happened to have been a girl, would Rabbi Akiva had acted differently? Would Rabbi Akiva had also teach the daughter Torah and also teach her Baruch Hu and also teach her Kaddish? My hunch is that because we say that women should not be leading a davar shebikdusha, which is Baruch Hu, then Rabbi Akiva wouldn't have taught her how to do Baruch Hu. But would Rabbi Akiva have taught her how to do maybe other mitzvot? I would assume yes. The reason why that's my hunch is because one of the differences between the Tana Devei Eliyahu and Rabbi Akiva is what the Tana taught the child. So whereas in Tana Devei Eliyahu, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai taught this child Baruch Hu for Tefillah B'tzibor and Torah, but not mention Kaddish.
Hmm.
Whereas in the Or Zarua, Rabbi Akiva does also teach Baruch Hu and Kaddish. I think the overall feeling here is that all the mitzvot that we do in some capacity are meant to release the soul from Gehenna. And I should add, when I say release the soul from Gehenom, do we know whether someone's neshama is in Gehenom or in Shemaim? Will we ever know? And the answer is that we don't, right? We have the final exam, right? When you have your chance to go to Shemaim and tell the Kaddish Baruch Hu about all the masim you've done in this world.
Hmm.
So do we know what that conversation with our creator looks like? No, we don't. And will we find out once our 120 years have passed? Yes. So as the living, we don't know what happens in the afterlife. We can only conjecture. Nevertheless, I agree with you. It's a good insurance policy. For what it's worth, what I've heard in the name of the Gra, and I've not seen this inside, but I have heard this. I'm sorry, I don't remember which rabbi taught this to me. Otherwise, I would say B'Shem Monroe. But evidently, the Gra's father said someone would only stay in Gehenom for 12 months. Gehenna is such a terrible place that the Kaddish Baruch Hu wouldn't want someone to spend a minute longer than 12 months. Why do people say Kaddish for 11? Because the Kaddish Baruch Hu believes that no one's truly such a rushastic a person to deserve a full 12. So we should say 11 as an insurance policy, but no one would really deserve 12. The Gra's father said, but I actually do deserve Gehenna. Do say Kaddish for me for the 12 months.
Oh boy.
Make of that what you
Very
will.
self-deprecating
Oh
to the
yeah.
extreme.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
Yeah, I remember. If I remember correctly, I think somewhere in Shar HaGemul, Ramban kind of has this whole. He really tries to systematize everything. He has this whole breakdown of if you've done like X amount of certain kinds of sins, you go for 11, and if you're of a really terrible category, you go for 12, and then there's kares for people who are even worse than that. So yeah, but as you point out, even the Ramban and anyone who really addresses the topic, usually at some point they slip in or they conclude by saying, but the best we can do is conjecture. But the point is, we have halachos, we have mitzvos, we have these rituals, and the best is to follow them to the best of our ability. So, okay. So, with that being said, let's jump ahead a nice number of years to, I think, the Chavos Yair, which is probably where this discussion begins for many people about women saying Kaddish. I believe it was in Amsterdam that he saw what was a davar zar, a very strange occurrence. Do you want to tell us about that?
Sure. The women going to shul has been much ink has been spilled about this question, and women find desiring to be part of this process of being doing the Ilui Neshama of their loved ones is has gained some traction in more recent years, uh, and so in the Teshuvahs of the Chavos Yair, we see that there's an objection to women saying Kaddish and Shul, but there's an opening for perhaps a more private setting. This is a concern of tzniut. And I think we need to actually open this up as a conversation. Um, I think what can be very challenging for a woman, and I include myself in this process, is that because Kaddish is not necessarily exactly a type of leading tefillah, but it certainly does have all the lookings of it in a certain way. It could bring unwanted attention onto the woman. And so it's this funny situation where on the one hand, you're not on the bima and you're not at the amud, you're not leading a tefillah, and yet you're also saying these words of the Kaddish that are meant to actually to have the function of doing something metaphysical. That's what tefillah also is, doing something metaphysical. So
Yeah.
I do actually see what the Chavos Yair is really saying, that if the goal is that we don't want to bring unwanted attention to women, because it could look like it could give the wrong impression. I actually do understand that.
Right. I think I think your point's very well taken, and just observing it in my own shul, there are women who would never have a havamina or a desire that they would want to lead davening, that they would want to kind of take a central role in leading a tefillah service, but nonetheless, like they feel that there's this need that they have to do something for their loved one. They have to do something for for their parent. And it's not coming, we could have a whole separate discussion, obviously, about women's roles and feminism. And obviously, these are all interlocking, interconnected topics. But I think your point's very well taken that this isn't coming clearly from any place of wanting attention. In fact, many people who come and say Kaddish, like, they just want to be able to say Kaddish. Like, it's odd because you need a tzibor. So it's inherently a public act, but many people are not looking for public attention. They specifically don't want the public attention. So on the one hand, your voice is being raised out loud, but it's not exactly the same as leading davening. And I think that's where we kind of see that little bit of a gray area of how people approach it. Some just group it together with davening and give a blank prohibition, and some don't see it that way. So just to point out just about the Chavos Yair. I don't think he makes the tznius point so much. He makes more of like the minhag argument was my recollection. I'd be remiss if I didn't quote this one line. He says, because if you're gonna he says actually fundamentally women are allowed to lead Kaddish. He actually quotes the story of Rabbi Akiva, and he says, but the issue is, if we start letting people make their own innovations, this is the slippery slope argument. So we're going to let everyone basically do whatever they want, make their own bamas, make their own mizbeach. So that's going to be a problem. He comes from more the minhag standpoint, but you're right. Others, I think we'll see in a moment, bring up the tznius issue. And I see you're able to relocate and find a more quiet place where you're recording from. So hopefully okay, back to you, Shalhevet.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is something that Rabbanit Nechama Goldman Bar Ash says, and I think it's a point very well taken, that when it comes to a number of these halachot about can a woman do X, she calls it permitted but forbidden. Right. And
nice formulation.
It's a nice formulation. It's a little tongue in cheek, but it's a point well taken. When it comes to Kaddish, although people hold on to it as if it were a mitzvah, functionally it's been a minhag actually. And then it's what we're saying is actually that the minhag is that the surviving males are the ones to say Kaddish. And the question is, well, what happens if there aren't males or those males are not able to do Kaddish? So how do we handle that? Right. I think about the Benot Tzlofchad, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where, well, what happens if he just didn't give birth to any boys? So what are we supposed to make of that? Right.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's one of these challenging situations where you don't want to necessarily make someone feel uncomfortable. And it is different. It hadn't been done before. That's definitionally what it means for something to be different.
Right. I think that's a fair point. And I think, just I was looking at the sources that you sent me. I think that the Teshuvah Me'ahava, I know you want to get to Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin's piece. So do you want to talk about the Teshuvah Me'ahava just for a moment before we get to that? Because he, I think, builds on the Chavos Yair. He makes a distinction between inside the shul versus outside the shul. And he also makes a distinction about the age of the child.
I'm looking in my notes one moment for the Teshuvah Me'ahava. Well, right, because the Teshuvah Me'ahava, I think, if I remember correctly, mentions that this is in the situation where there are no sons, right? And so in the event of kind of like the Benot Slavchan, if you will, there are no sons, but there is a daughter. And he says, well, just don't do it in shul. And so I think this by saying don't do it in shul, he's saying that it's technically mutter, but again, this is about community custom and not wanting to draw attention.
Well, what's really fascinating is, he doesn't just make the community argument. He quotes a Zohar, actually. And I think it's just like a great example. You mentioned the story of Rabbi Akiva beforehand, the different versions of that. We learned so much of Hilchos Avelis from Agadata or from non-conventional sources, from non-halachic sources. So he quotes a Zohar toward the end, which you provided me. He says, Ha'isha, I'm going to get this is not me saying it. This is the Zohar saying it. For our listeners, before you all Facebook mom me on this. Ha'isha bebeis Hashem kamaras pesel sham. He says that a woman in the house of God is like putting a pesel in there.
An idol.
Yeah, okay. I wanted you to translate that. I didn't want to get in trouble. Umali katan gadol. And what's the difference between the age at that point? So he actually quotes the Zohar saying that fundamentally he believes that women shouldn't be in shul bichlal. So that's just like that's not the typical argument you hear. The typical argument is like what you said, that people are worried about community standards, people are worried about perception, people are worried about, like the Chavos Yair said about minhag. But here the Shlomo Wahrman just like throws a Zohar out of nowhere into here, saying categorically women shouldn't be in shul, which pretty clear to me, minhag modern Orthodox has not adopted that Zohar.
Right. Not only that, he says Ladad HaZohar v'chachmei emes. Right. So
right. Even if you're not a Zohar person, the Chacham Emes, if you're like, a true Chacham holding up our Masorah, you're on board with the Zohar. Rationalists have to agree as well, if that's what he's referring to. Or maybe he means old Kabbalists when he says that, probably.
Probably, I assume so. But even so, the word MS is very striking.
Right. It's very strident. It's very strident. Like, you're either right or you're wrong on this, it sounds like.
The irony is that my sister Yehudi, after finishing the year of Kaddish, wrote a beautiful Dvar Torah about what it was like for her to say Kaddish. And she actually took this idea, but she twisted it in a different way. That here, when he's speaking about drawing attention and he uses the strong word of pesel, like making an idol, he's trying to show just how egregious, just how terrible, just how awful it would be to change that tradition. And my sister Yehudit actually saw the opposite. She actually felt that by saying Kaddish, it drew attention to her, but not because she was seeking attention in it, but rather it was an indicator for other people to go over to her and say, oh, I see you're saying Kaddish. Can you tell me more about who you're saying Kaddish for? And it actually became an opportunity for people to connect with her and to support her through that struggle. That actually happened to me once. It was because I lost my father in 2020. It meant that all the tefillos were happening outside, right? My father passed away on Chavchat Tevet Koach. He died on a day of strength, but it was Chavchat Teves. And so it meant that we were able to have a Levaya, Kavura, and Shiva in the before times, which meant with people indoors and however we wanted. But then it meant that after the Shloshim, a week afterwards, that's when lockdown happened. And so the majority of the time that I was saying Kaddish had to be in outdoor minyanim, and including for the Yemim Noraim. And so my shul, we were davening outside in a park, and someone was passing by, and tefillah was ending, and it was right before Kaddish. And so this person ad hoc decided to join the minyan. They saw I was saying Kaddish, and then during Kaddish, they just asked, I saw you were saying Kaddish. Can you tell me who you were saying Kaddish for? Oh. And it began actually an amazing conversation about my father and how much he meant to me. So I actually, even though this question of drawing attention has its detriments and it could become something very uncomfortable, I also think of this counterpoint from my sister Yehudit and my actual lived personal experience, that it became a conversation starter and therefore the beginning of emotional support for me.
Right. Thank you. And so what would your advice be in general? Like if I'm someone who is typically davening at a shul and one day I just see a woman who's coming in and she starts saying Kaddish, do you think in general, obviously I know you can't speak for all women in the world, but as a rule of thumb, what would your advice be to how to like go over them, say, like in your case, start a conversation who you're saying Kaddish for? Do you find that most people would be appreciative of that, or is that more just your unique approach to it?
I can only speak for myself, and I can say for me that I do appreciate when people come over to you and ask a conversation with a question,
Mm-hmm.
not to project and assume how I might feel about something that is charged and emotional, but rather letting me be in the driver's seat and say how I am experiencing a moment.
Mm,
I one time I was saying Kaddish and someone was saying, this must be so sad and so painful.
uh,
That was presumptuous.
mm,
Actually, I found these tefillot to be one of the most healing and moving parts of my experience in lifting up the memory of my father. So no, it actually wasn't sad. Uh, Alternatively, for my father's yahrzeit, my sister Yehudita and I, we decided to say Kaddish together as a way to be together as a family on this important moment for us. And so I began crying during Kaddish. So yes, it was appropriate when someone came over to me afterwards and said, I saw that you were really moved. Can you tell me more about what's going on?
mm,
By leaving the question open-ended, you put the person in the driver's seat to communicate how they're actually feeling. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that mourners are mourners together. Something that's amazing about Kaddish is that often in a shul, it's already new, but the reality is multiple people are saying Kaddish at once. And there's nothing quite like the experience of being able to speak to another person who knows what you're going through, who's also lost a parent. One of the challenges for me is that I lost a parent when I was young. I was in my 20s. I have a whole lot of life to live without a parent, and that's something really
mm,
hard. And so it meant that whenever I would say Kaddish, I would either have to prearrange with the shul that someone else would say Kaddish with me, or if it was the type of community where I either I would forget to contact them in advance, or I would just kind of wing it and go for it. They, you know, when saying it by myself as a young person and as a woman, that was painful. That was hard. So I think when people do come over to offer their support, I'm a believer that more is more. More
mhm,
support, more how is this going for you? Keeping it open-ended, more is more.
mhm. So and considering that
And so,
you're,
and oh,
oh,
so
sorry.
to clarify what I realized that I should have clarified this final point, that when mourners are able to then go to each other,
Mm,
not just in the recitation of the Kaddish itself, but then also to go over to each other and say, who are you saying Kaddish for? How's it going for you? That also can be a special type of support.
right. I think I've heard people refer to it as the Kaddish Club. It becomes a certain, obviously they meant a little bit of a cutesy way of saying it, but right, there's a certain feeling of almost camaraderie, fellowship, like we're going through, obviously not the same, but we're in a boat of similar situations. So it is very evident from what you're sharing that your ultimate decision, of course, was to say Kaddish. And we've until now saw two sources that seemed adamantly against women reciting Kaddish. I was wondering if you could share with our listeners what sources informed you ultimately to make that decision to say Kaddish, because I know you're a very halakhically knowledgeable person. So, what were the halakhic sources that kind of supported that decision?
The conversation for me begins with the Rav Henkin in HaPardes, and where he speaks about women saying Kaddish, and he says like Im habat tavo palel be'ezras nashim v'tachshir ma'aseh b'kedushat hashabat kashrut tahara b'tzniut v'chol הם עיקרים ותחפוץ לומר גם קדיש בפני הנשים, בזמן שאומרים קדיש בבית הכנסת של האנשים, אפשר שאין קפידה. And I think that was an important line for me.
So, just
And
for
so
our for our listeners, so what was he saying in that line?
he was saying that when a person is a person of Torah mitzvos and she's living a life where mitzvot are an everyday part of her experience of avodas Hashem, it follows that she would also then, if she would like to then say Kaddish as well, then please, like then she should say Kaddish in the women's section in her shul.
Mm-hmm. And so what does Rav Henkin then say about someone who otherwise, I see in the next sentence, he talks about
Yes.
women who aren't necessarily as following an observant lifestyle. What's his advice to them regarding saying Kaddish?
It is challenging, but the next line, because he does say that if someone is, he calls it Levushe America, make up that line. It wasn't
Levushé
sure.
America.
But if someone is not dressed in an appropriate way, then he says it's hefech. It's the opposite of the intention, right? And then it would be a tsa'ar for the niftar if it would not cause the good feelings that otherwise could be coming from Kaddish. I think the approach then, if for what he's saying, is that if someone's dressed inappropriately, they ought not to say Kaddish. I'm reminded of when I was a teenager on a B'nai Akiva program called Machach Ba'aretz,
Mm-hmm.
and we would visit Batei Knasiot and Tzfat that were very holy and very special. Or when I used to have birthright trips and we go to the Kotel, you know what? These shuls provide shawls. They provide a covering, something to be a little more covered up to out of respect for the place. And it can be when I believe that every person's in control of their reactions. And if someone says, okay, this is part of the respect of the space and they're giving me something to cover up my body, then I say good. I could also understand if someone would find that a breach and would be frustrated by that. But I believe, if he's saying that such a person who's not dressed in an appropriate way should not be saying Kaddish, then okay, he's just really speaking about decorum. And so there's a way to fix decorum and provide a shawl.
Right. I think that's a good point. And many shuls like ours, I guess we have a doily box, we have a yarmulke box. So even if someone came without without the proper attire, they still have something that's being provided by the shul. Maybe it's incumbent upon the shul to ensure that it's welcoming in that respect, that if you have a certain standard, maybe meet people halfway and make sure that that standard is achievable. Though what found fascinating, his formulation at the end of the passage of that paragraph, he says, now, even though the tznius considerations you mentioned would be an issue outside of shul, we've seen many sources that make a distinction between shul versus outside of shul. The Zohar comes, of course, from a Kabbalistic standpoint, but he comes from a very pragmatic standpoint for Henkin. If Yosef Eliyahu Henkin says, "Avol habeis hakneses hu hamifsar ha'acharon sheshmirasanu," says tikva l'kedusha b'chlal. It's like the final fortress. It's the final line of defense. But if we were to kind of just destroy any kedusha in the shul, if we weren't to defend every inch of it, hakol avad chas v'sham. So I think some of the defensiveness is not necessarily coming from a place of it might not even be inherently tied to Kaddish. I guess it is tied to women. You can't ignore that. But his interest seems to be just that he's looking at America right now, the time he's living, and he's seeing Western civilization. He's seeing the modernization. He's seeing the secularization. He's seeing that, religion is slowly seeping away from centrality within general public life. And he's, especially in Jewish life, and he's saying to himself, maybe there's room for flexibility and we need to be welcoming. We need to be accommodating. I'm putting these words in, but I assume he wants to be welcoming. I'll be down the cuffs on that. But at the same time, we also have to make sure, remember, if a shul doesn't do things right, we can't expect anywhere to do it right. The shul needs to be a model for what is pristine religiosity. And so we're trying to kind of balance the being welcome to everyone coming while also ensuring the integrity of the Kedusha, the Beis HaKnesses. And this seems to be kind of one of those flashpoints. We have about 2 minutes left, and I wanted to just get your final thoughts on this, anything you didn't cover. And also I just wanted to ask, you kind of addressed a little bit of this already, but I have a two-pronged question. One is, what advice would you have for a shul that its culture is not for women to say Kaddish? Not just simply never happened, but that's their minhag, that's their policy decision. Full disclosure, my shul, the women do say Kaddish. But I know many Orthodox shuls, in fact, probably most Orthodox shuls, I'd wager, the cultures that women do not say Kaddish, probably as a matter of principle or policy, even if it's not written down for some, they never even had the Havamina to write it down. They never thought there was a need. So what would your advice be to the shuls that if that is their policy, what could they still do to be welcoming to women who are navelis and want to honor their parents' memory? And what could a woman who is coming to a shul like that, how can they best prepare themselves for that experience?
I understand the Batei Knesiot, where it is either policy written or unwritten for women to not say Kaddish. I understand that because we see in the sources, there are sources who say that it ought not to happen. Nevertheless, my hope and belief is that shuls can move the needle on this policy. My belief is because women should have their rabbanim prioritize their religious needs and spiritual needs. And it's one thing if women come forward saying, I need this, but it's even more meaningful or more impactful when rabbanim come to women who are mourning and say, I see how this is a struggle. This could be something, maybe a struggle, maybe something painful. And I don't want you to have to fight this. I would like to make a space for you to process this. It's the way I like the phrasing of Dr. Leon Wieseltier. The way he phrases it is that, may a woman say Kaddish? Oh, what a controversial question. It sounds like a provocation. But he says you should ask the question differently. May a daughter say Kaddish? And suddenly the way he phrases it is suddenly the controversy disappears, because he says, if you deny Kaddish to the daughter, then you do not understand Kaddish. Kaddish is not an obligation of gender. It is an obligation of descent. This is not about men. This is about sons. This is not about women. This is about daughters. And so if we realize the power that Kaddish has for daughters, and rabbis are supporting daughters in the recitation of Kaddish for their parents, that can be a very powerful indicator that the rabbi is choosing to support and prioritize women's spiritual needs at a time when they are grieving. I once was speaking to a woman many years ago where she was davening in a Chabad, and she said Kaddish for her father, and the Chabad rabbi told her that she should not do that anymore. It was not acceptable in her shul. She never went back to that shul.
Right.
I cannot emphasize enough that this issue is it's not a black and white mitzvah d'oraisa. It's not even a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. It's a minhag that people take on as if it were a mitzvah, and it means a lot to people. So I think it's an act of leadership for a rabbi to prioritize this. Nevertheless, if a rabbi is not able to take this on in his shul, whether on a halachic grounds or hashkafic grounds, I would suggest the following. And the suggestion comes from, I was speaking to a Rabbanit who was running a women's tefillah group, and she said that at a women's tefillah group, there's not a minyan of men, because a halachic minyan is 10 men above the age of bar mitzvah. So what she does at the women's tefillah group is that at the time when Kaddish would have otherwise been said, she invites people in the room to say the name of someone who they want to remember, either someone they want to remember because it is the year that Kaddish is said, or that someone you want to remember because you believe that saying their name in this space would give you meaning. And so it is fulfilling the same function, but not in the same means. And so I think that is a meaningful alternative to invite women and anyone else in the shul to then say the name of their beloved, who they otherwise would be saying Kaddish for. So what I'm trying to say is that if the answer is no, it is then incumbent on the rabbi to provide an alternative. And I think that could be an alternative, and that could be explored.
Right. Well, I really appreciate that, because I think that's a good point. It's not a zero-sum game. The question is, if there's not something that's viable for the shul, either on halachic grounds, whatever grounds, question is, what could we do to support the daughters and anyone who's going through a mourning and grieving time in their life? That's very important to think about. And I really appreciate you joining us here today. I think you've given a lot of content, a lot of food for thought for our listeners, certainly for myself as a rabbi, even though we have women who say Kaddish in our shul, and that's fully accepted. It still got me to think a lot more about this topic and be hopefully more sensitive. And just want to wish, you and your family, God willing, you should have continued nechama, continued strength, and looking forward to learning more Torah from you in the future. Thank you so much for your time here today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This was an honor to be here. Thank you.
Take care.